A single dad is humiliated when no one bids for him at a charity auction, until a mysterious billionaire raises her hand and changes his life in front of the whole town. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? Ethan Cole hadn't meant to stop by the school office that morning, but Ava, as usual, had left something important behind, this time her spelling workbook, and her hopeful little voice had won him over before he'd even finished his coffee. The office smelled like sharpened pencils and stale copier ink, the kind of scent that reminded him of science fairs and last-minute bake sales. He handed the book to the front desk, offered a quick thank you, and turned to leave, until something bold and glittery caught his eye. A poster, practically screaming for attention, was pinned dead center on the bulletin board. Hollow Creek Elementary Bachelor Auction, this Saturday, the headline announced in big, sparkly letters. Below were snapshots from last year. Mr. Jenkins, the high school math teacher, awkwardly smiling in a tux, the town's fire chief flexing with a puppy, and even grumpy old Mr. Dobbs, holding a fishing rod like he'd been dragged into the event against his will. Ethan shook his head and laughed quietly. "Daddy, look!" Ava was suddenly at his side, tugging on his sleeve, her face lit up like a Christmas tree. She pointed at the poster, eyes wide with wonder. "You should do that." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Sweetheart, I'm not exactly auction material." "Yes, you are," she insisted. "You help people, you build stuff, you fixed our whole porch. You're like a superhero, but with tools instead of a cape." He laughed. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. And maybe someone rich will bid on you and take us out for ice cream," she added, beaming. "That's not quite how it works." "But you always say helping the school is important," she said, suddenly serious. Ethan glanced back at the poster. He'd donated wood for the playground last fall, fixed the soccer bleachers when they collapsed. But standing on a stage in front of the entire town, hoping someone would raise a hand, still, there was Ava, believing in him without hesitation. He pulled the bottom tab off the flyer with a sigh. "Okay, but only if you promise not to bid with crayons." Ava giggled and threw her arms around him, and just like that, Ethan Cole was in. Ethan Cole stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie he hadn't worn since his cousin's wedding 3 years ago. The second-hand suit was a decent fit, if a bit snug in the shoulders, and the shoes pinched just enough to remind him they weren't made for walking. Ava had picked out the tie, a navy blue one with tiny silver stars, and insisted it brought out his eyes. He didn't argue. He was just hoping to survive the night without tripping over himself. Down the hall, Ava peeked into his room with a proud grin. "You look like a movie star, Daddy." Ethan turned, giving her a playful bow. "Well, thank you, ma'am. You approve?" She gave him 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. "Totally. Just remember to smile, and don't make your nervous face." "I have a nervous face?" She nodded seriously. "It's the one where your eyebrows look like they're trying to escape your forehead." He laughed, then bent to kiss the top of her head. "All right. I'll keep the eyebrows in check." Outside, the night air was crisp, the kind that hinted spring was still weeks away. The town's rec center was glowing with lights, music spilling from its doors. He could already hear the crowd, laughter, heels clicking against tile, champagne flutes clinking. As he stepped inside, the warmth hit him, followed by a wave of unfamiliarity. Everything smelled of expensive perfume and something citrusy that definitely didn't belong in a place that usually hosted middle school dances and bake sales. The room was filled with polished suits, glittering dresses, and people who looked like they hadn't touched a wrench in their lives. Ethan tugged at his collar, trying to breathe. He felt like a guy who'd wandered into the wrong movie set. And yet, somewhere across the room, someone had transformed a school fundraiser into something that looked like a magazine spread. A few people offered polite smiles. Most didn't look twice. He walked slowly, scanning the crowd, hands tucked in his pockets like armor. He wasn't sure what was worse, the waiting or the wondering if anyone would bid at all. Ethan stood near the refreshment table, clutching a glass of lukewarm punch he had no intention of drinking. He scanned the crowd, trying to anchor himself in the sea of sequins and smiles, when the lights dimmed slightly and a voice cut through the gentle hum of chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight." Every head turned toward the stage, and there she was, Isabella Hart. She stood beneath the soft glow of the spotlight, poised as if she belonged there, and maybe she did. Her midnight blue gown shimmered as she moved, simple but unmistakably expensive. Dark hair framed her face in soft waves, and her voice held that effortless calm that made people lean in without realizing they were doing it. No microphone needed, just presence. No one really knew much about her. She'd moved to Hollow Creek a few months ago, bought the old Langford estate on the hill, and kept to herself since. People whispered. Some said she was a venture capitalist. Others guessed old money, oil money, maybe tech. But nobody could quite pin her down, and she wasn't offering details. She wasn't loud. She didn't throw parties or wave around her wealth. But she showed up to school meetings, quietly donated to the library fund, and somehow ended up chairing the most talked-about event of the year. "Tonight's auction is about more than dates and dances," Isabella said, eyes sweeping across the room. "It's about showing up for the kids in this town, their books, their classrooms, their future." People clapped, charmed. Ethan just watched. She was different from the people he was used to. There was polish, yes, but also weight. Like she carried something she didn't talk about. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and when she looked over the crowd, it wasn't for show. It was like she was searching for something. As the music resumed and the first name was called to the stage, Ethan took another sip of the punch after all. Bitter. Too sweet. He wasn't sure which. He didn't know it yet, but the woman in the midnight gown had just noticed him too. The crowd had warmed up fast. Laughter echoed off the rec center walls, glasses clinked, and paddle numbers flew through the air like confetti. A retired firefighter went for 300 to raucous applause. A yoga instructor, whose abs should have had their own zip code, sparked a bidding war that had the front row practically standing. Even the local dentist, nervous and blinking like a deer in headlights, walked off the stage to a round of cheers and a date with the mayor's cousin. Ethan Cole stood in the wings, trying not to shift too much in his tight shoes. His palms were damp. He could feel the heat creeping under his collar. Ava's voice echoed in his head. "Just smile, Daddy. You'll do great." But it was hard to believe it now. "Next up," the announcer said with a theatrical grin, "is a man who keeps this town running, literally. Give it up for Ethan Cole." There was polite applause, not wild, not awkward, just safe. Ethan stepped onto the stage, smiling like he was supposed to, even though it felt like the spotlight was peeling off his skin. He tried not to fidget. He tried not to wonder if anyone saw the scuff on his shoes or the small fray in his jacket cuff. He just stood there, hoping for something. "Do I hear 100?" the announcer called out cheerfully. Silence. A few people flipped through their programs. One woman looked at her phone. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed. 80? The announcer tried, tone still upbeat. Nothing. Ethan's smile twitched. He glanced to the side of the stage. No one was laughing. No one was cruel. They just weren't bidding. Not because they disliked him, but because he didn't shine. He didn't dazzle. He was familiar, and familiar doesn't spark a bidding war. Ava was in the crowd, sitting cross-legged on a chair that was way too big for her. Her chin rested on her fists. She looked so hopeful. Too hopeful. Ethan's chest tightened, and that's when a voice, clear, smooth, and steady, broke through the quiet. 5,000. Every head turned. Isabella Hart sat perfectly still, paddle in hand, expression unreadable. But her eyes never left his. Ethan froze. For a split second, he thought he'd misheard. 5,000. The number floated in the air like smoke, impossible and surreal. The crowd didn't erupt. It didn't even clap. Instead, the room fell into a stunned kind of stillness, like everyone had paused mid-thought, unsure how to process what had just happened. Isabella Hart still held her paddle aloft, her expression calm, not smug, not amused, just certain. Her eyes didn't flinch, and she didn't shift in her seat. She wasn't playing a game, she wasn't making a scene, but she'd just bid more money than anyone all night, on the one man no one else had even raised a hand for. The announcer coughed. 5,000 to Miss Hart. Do I hear any challengers?" Silence. Somewhere near the back, a whisper. Then another. A few glances. A few polite smiles that weren't smiles at all. One woman leaned into her friend and said something behind her hand. Ethan caught none of it, but he didn't need to. He'd seen that look before, the one that asked, "Why him?" On stage, his smile began to slip, just slightly. The kind of shift no one would notice unless they were looking closely. But someone was. Ava. She sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clutching the edge of her sparkly purse. Her eyes weren't shining anymore. She was trying to figure it out. Why had no one clapped? Why had the air gotten weird? Why were people suddenly looking at her dad like he didn't belong? Ethan's throat tightened. He tried to soften his face, tried to send her a look that said everything was okay. But the moment had stretched too long, too awkward, too quiet, too sharp around the edges. The announcer cleared his throat again. "Sold to Miss Hart for $5,000. A few people clapped, finally, as if they were just remembering the script. Ethan nodded, stepped off the stage, and walked back into the crowd with the quiet dignity of a man who wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or humiliated. Ethan had already started to shift his weight, muscles tense and ready to step off the stage. The silence had gone from awkward to suffocating, and all he wanted was to disappear, back to the garage, back to the comfort of socket wrenches and oil stains, back to the version of life that didn't come with stages and staring eyes. His smile was fading. He turned slightly, half a step toward the stairs, already preparing himself to joke it off for Ava's sake. To pretend it didn't matter. To say something like, "Guess they were saving their money for dessert." Then it happened. 5,000. The words sliced clean through the hush like a warm knife. Calm, steady, unmistakable. Ethan stopped. All heads turned in the same direction drawn by the voice. There, near the center of the room, Isabella Hart sat with her paddle raised and her expression unreadable. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't fidget like someone second-guessing a decision. Her posture was as poised as ever, but there was something different in her eyes, something intentional. The room didn't know how to react. A beat passed, then another. The announcer stammered, caught mid-sentence. 5,000, we have 5,000 for Miss Hart." He looked around the room almost as if begging someone, anyone, to raise a hand in response. But no one did. The bid stood alone. Ethan turned back toward the crowd, but his gaze locked on hers, and hers didn't waver. He searched her face for the why. Why him? Why now? But she gave him nothing more than the smallest nod, an almost imperceptible gesture that felt like both a rescue and a challenge. The moment held its breath. Then the gavel dropped. "Sold to Miss Hart," the announcer said, finding his voice again, "for $5,000. The room gave a smattering of applause, some genuine, some delayed, some uncertain, but none of it mattered to Ethan. All he could feel was the weight of that voice still ringing in his ears, and the strange, unfamiliar spark it left behind. Gasps weren't common in Hollow Creek. This was a town more used to murmurs and polite nods than anything resembling shock. But when Isabella Hart calmly raised her paddle and declared 5,000, the collective inhale around the room sounded like the first crack of a thunderstorm on a quiet day. It wasn't just the amount, it was the moment. The room had already decided Ethan Cole wasn't the man anyone would bid on. That decision had passed silently from table to table, wrapped in kind smiles and diverted eyes. He didn't sparkle, he didn't strut. He stood there steady, a mechanic in a borrowed suit, more familiar than flashy. And yet here she was, dropping the highest bid of the night without blinking. The whispers started fast. Is she serious? Did he know her before this? She could have had anyone. 5,000 for him. Ethan stood still, jaw clenched, trying to hold on to some kind of dignity. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. But hearing it, the disbelief, the quiet dissection of his worth, stung in places he hadn't touched in years. He scanned the crowd, tried to find Ava. She was sitting exactly where he left her, wide-eyed and gripping the edge of her chair. She didn't understand the numbers or the whispers, but she felt the shift in the room, and she watched her father closely, like she was trying to figure out how to feel based on his face. He gave her the smallest smile, one corner of his mouth, just enough to say, "I'm okay." Isabella, on the other hand, didn't flinch. She didn't turn to the voices. She didn't offer an explanation. She simply set her paddle down and took a sip of her champagne, as if $5,000 was pocket change, and what she had done wasn't a disruption, but a decision. The MC awkwardly moved on to the next name. Applause returned, but softer now. The energy in the room had shifted, no longer just light-hearted charity, but something else entirely. And as Ethan stepped down from the stage, he could feel it in every stare that followed him. The auction had crowned its surprise. And no one knew what to make of it. The auction ended with confetti poppers and polite clapping, but Ethan barely registered any of it. He waited near the side of the hall as the other bachelors shook hands, exchanged numbers, posed for photos. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next. Was this a real date? A polite gesture? A punchline? Ava had run up to him after the auction, beaming. "You were amazing," she whispered, hugging his waist tight. He smiled down at her, squeezing back gently. He still didn't feel amazing, just confused. Then Isabella Hart approached. She walked through the crowd with the same quiet confidence she'd carried all night, her heels clicking softly against the floor, people parting for her without needing to be asked. Her expression was unreadable, her posture perfect, but her eyes, they were focused, not distant or amused, just clear. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending a hand, "you were very brave tonight." He shook it, not knowing what else to do. Thanks. I'm not sure brave's the right word. Mostly just trying not to fall off the stage." She smiled, the kind that didn't stretch wide, but felt real. "Still, you stood up there. That's more than most would do." He cleared his throat, unsure how to meet her gaze. "I appreciate the bid. Really, you didn't have to do that." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." That made him pause. He glanced around. The whispers hadn't fully died down, and more than a few curious eyes were still pointed in their direction. He kept his voice low. "Look, I don't know what kind of statement you were trying to make, but you didn't have to save me. I'm not some charity case." She tilted her head, her expression soft but steady. "Do I look like someone who pities people, Mr. Cole?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. "I don't pity a man who shows up," she said simply, "especially one who does it for the right reasons." Before he could answer, she turned slightly toward Ava and knelt down. "I think your dad's the bravest man in the room." Ava grinned. Ethan didn't know what to say, because for the first time all night he didn't feel small. He just didn't understand why. The invitation came the next morning, neatly folded in an envelope Ava found tucked between their screen door and the welcome mat. Inside, a simple card in elegant handwriting. "Lunch, my treat. No pressure, just a thank you. Isabella." Below it, the name of a cafe downtown, the one with the mismatched chairs and ivy crawling up its windows. Ethan stared at the card longer than he needed to, unsure if it was a real invitation or just a polite obligation wrapped in expensive stationery. He almost didn't go, but Ava had already picked out which of his shirts he should wear. "The gray one," she said with authority, "makes you look like someone who knows things." So he put the same suit back on. the one from the auction, still a little wrinkled, but decent enough. He didn't have another. When he stepped into the cafe, he instantly felt overdressed. The air smelled of fresh basil and espresso, warm and inviting. At a corner table, there she was, Isabella Hart. No gown, no heels, just a soft denim jacket, jeans, and a loosely tied bun that made her look like she belonged in a painting, not a boardroom. She looked up and smiled. "You wore the suit." He shifted uncomfortably. "Didn't know if this was, formal." She gestured to the seat across from her. "It's lunch, Ethan, not a press conference." He sat, still feeling like a mannequin next to her effortless ease. "Appreciate the invite, though I'm still not sure what I'm being thanked for." "For showing up," she said. "For being decent in a world that keeps rewarding loud." The server came. She ordered chamomile tea and a tomato sandwich. Ethan got coffee, and whatever special came with fries. Their conversation didn't start with work or weather. It started with small things. Why he named his dog Baxter. Why she never liked champagne. It wasn't a date. But it didn't feel like a favor either. When they left the cafe, she walked him to his truck. No lingering glances, no promises, just a quiet moment where two very different lives overlapped, and neither one felt out of place. The pie came halfway through the meal, warm apple with cinnamon drifting off the crust like a promise. Ethan hadn't meant to order dessert, but Isabella had looked at the chalkboard and said, "Life's too short to skip pie," and somehow that was reason enough. The cafe had quieted by then, just a few late lunch stragglers scattered around, the hum of conversation soft and forgiving. Their table sat by the window, sunlight trickling through the ivy-laced glass, dappling the table in gold. They didn't talk about the auction, or the money, or why she'd raised her paddle in a room full of silence. Instead, they talked about things that didn't make the headlines. Ethan told her about Ava, how she always made up songs when brushing her teeth, how she left crayon notes in his lunchbox even though he never asked her to, how sometimes he worried he was failing her, and she didn't even know it yet. Isabella listened, really listened, her tea growing cold beside her. "She sounds like she's got more heart than most grown-ups I know," she said. He smiled, the kind that came without effort. "She's the best part of me." Then she surprised him. "My mother left when I was 9, she said quietly. Took one suitcase and vanished into the kind of silence that sticks to your bones. Ethan didn't speak, he just let her go on. "My dad never remarried, built his world around engines and socket wrenches. He didn't know how to talk about it, so he taught me how to change oil instead." There was a pause, not heavy, just real. "I guess I always trusted people who know how to fix things," she added. He looked at her then. Not the suit, not the bank account, not the town's mystery woman, but the person. The one who understood what it meant to be left, and what it meant to stay anyway. Outside, a breeze stirred the ivy. Inside, the silence between them had shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It was comfortable, familiar. They didn't need to say what had changed. They just knew something had, and neither one wanted to leave the table first. The drawing was taped to the fridge before Ethan even realized what he was looking at. Ava had brought it home from school, proudly pulling it from her backpack like it was the crown jewel of her art portfolio. "We were supposed to draw our family," she'd said, standing on tiptoe to smooth the tape. Ethan leaned in, grinning at the curly stick figures. There he was, messy hair, big smile, tool belt slung over a cartoon waist. Ava had drawn herself with purple pigtails and glittery shoes, and next to them, holding both their hands, was a woman in a long blue dress, her smile soft and her eyes bright. He tilted his head. "Who's this?" Ava gave him a duh look. "That's Miss Isabella, from the auction. She belongs with us now." Ethan let out a small laugh, more surprised than anything. "She belongs with us?" "Yeah," Ava said matter-of-factly. "She likes you, and she drinks tea, not yucky coffee. That's a good sign." He chuckled and ruffled her hair. "Is that so?" Ava nodded. You smiled different after lunch, like someone turned a light on inside you." Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he looked back at the drawing. The little trio stood beneath a lopsided rainbow, the word family scribbled across the top in purple marker. It should have just been cute, a kid's imagination running wild, but it lingered in a way he didn't expect. He hadn't told Ava much, just that Isabella had invited him to lunch as a thank you. No details, no stories, certainly no mention of how, over coffee and pie, he'd laughed more than he had in months. He didn't know what he and Isabella were: a conversation, a curiosity, a pause in two very different lives. But something about seeing her drawn there, next to him, next to Ava, planted a thought he couldn't quite shake. He smiled, taped the picture straighter, and said, "Guess I better step up my tea game." Ava beamed. "Told you she's one of the good ones." And for the first time, Ethan wasn't so sure his daughter's imagination was getting ahead of her. Maybe it was just seeing the truth before he could. The wind had howled all night, rattling windows and shaking the loose gutter Ethan kept meaning to fix. He hadn't slept much. Ava had crawled into his bed around midnight, scared of the thunder, and he'd held her close as the storm raged outside. When dawn finally broke, the air was heavy and still, the kind of silence that felt like the world was holding its breath. Ethan dropped Ava off at school with a tired smile and a promise of hot cocoa after pickup. Then he headed to the garage, half hoping the storm had spared it. It hadn't. The moment he turned the corner and saw the jagged tear in the roof, his stomach sank. The metal sheeting had peeled back like a sardine can. Water had poured in, soaking the workbench, the walls, the wiring. Tools lay scattered across the floor in puddles of freezing rain, and the air inside smelled like rust and defeat. He stood in the doorway for a long minute, just breathing. This wasn't just a leak or a few broken shingles. This was weeks of lost work, months of tight margins gone tighter. It wasn't just his job, it was his livelihood, his independence, the place where he'd taught Ava how to hold a wrench and where he stayed late to help the elderly couple whose brakes failed. This garage wasn't just a building. It was his legacy, even if no one else saw it that way. He picked his way through the wet floor, salvaging what he could. A soaked customer invoice, a wrench his father had given him. A picture of Ava taped above his tool chest, the corners curled from years of engine heat. By the time he called the insurance company, his voice was tight. The deductible was more than he had, and even if he scraped it together, the downtime would gut him. As he stood beneath the gaping hole and watched a drip fall from the exposed beam, Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and muttered to no one, "One step forward, two back." What he didn't know was that someone else had already heard about the storm and wasn't planning to let him face it alone. The bell above the garage door jingled just before noon, its sound unusually soft against the backdrop of dripping water and Ethan's frustrated muttering. He didn't look up at first, figuring it was someone from town wanting a tire rotation or to check on their truck, but then he caught the familiar click of boots, the steady, deliberate pace that didn't belong to someone needing an oil change. Isabella Hart stepped into the soaked garage like it was nothing more than a puddle at her feet. No umbrella, no entourage, just her. In a wool coat the color of charcoal, sleeves rolled back, eyes sweeping across the wreckage like she was taking inventory of a challenge. Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on a towel, already too damp to be useful. "You lost?" She smiled slightly. "Not today." Her gaze drifted upward, to the torn metal and the open sky beyond it. "Heard the storm got rough over here. I wanted to check in." He shifted, uncomfortable. "Nothing I can't fix." She didn't flinch. "Looks like the roof might disagree." Ethan let out a short laugh and dropped the rag on the workbench. "I'll figure it out. Just gotta stretch a few things." Isabella stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I know a guy." He raised an eyebrow. "Of course you do." Or, she continued unbothered, "I could just be the guy." That stopped him cold. For a second he wasn't sure if he'd heard her right. "You?" She shrugged. It's just a roof. I've funded buildings with foundations that weren't even straight. This place? It's got soul. That's harder to come by. Ethan's jaw tightened. I don't want charity. Her expression softened, but her voice didn't waver. And I'm not offering it. I'm offering partnership, respect, investment in something that matters. He didn't answer right away. The pride in him wanted to push her away. But the truth? He was drowning, and someone had just offered a rope. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. Think about it. You'd do the same if our roles were reversed. He watched her go, the quiet strength in her steps louder than any thunder the storm had thrown. And for the first time in days, Ethan wasn't sure saying no would feel like the right kind of win. Ethan didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the drip, drip, drip of rain still echoing in his head even though the storm had passed. Pride kept him awake, wrestling with logic. He could scrape by, sure, pawn a few tools, beg for extensions, maybe patch the roof himself over a few painful weekends. But Ava deserved better. So did the garage. By morning, the decision was made, reluctantly, quietly, and with more humility than he wanted to admit. He showed up at the cafe at 8:02 a.m., just as the barista was unlocking the door. Isabella was already seated at her usual table, a cup of tea in front of her, unread newspaper beside it, as if she'd been waiting. He didn't sit right away, just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets. I'm not taking your money, he said. She looked up. Then why are you here? He exhaled. Because I'll accept your help, but not as a handout, not as a favor. I want terms. That made her smile, not condescending, almost impressed. All right, what kind of terms? You become a silent partner, he said. No decisions unless I ask. No names on signs. No one even needs to know. Just help me fix the place, and I'll pay you back, every penny. She nodded slowly. That's fair. Ethan hesitated. Also, I'm calling it a loan with soul. Isabella blinked. A what? A loan with soul, as he repeated, sheepish, but stubborn. Because this place, my garage, it's not just about bolts and brake fluid. It's my story, Ava's future. It deserves more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Her smile widened, just enough to change the light in her eyes. Then, it's a deal. He finally slid into the seat across from her, and for a moment they just sat there, two people from wildly different worlds, agreeing to build something that neither could fully explain. She extended her hand across the table, to soul. He took it, firm and honest, to soul. And just like that, Hollow Creek had a new business partnership, one built not on contracts, but on trust. It didn't take long. In a town like Hollow Creek, secrets moved slower than storms, but gossip rode the wind. By Wednesday, the whispers had already started. They came in sideways glances at the gas station, in not-so-quiet chuckles at the diner, in the carefully worded questions masked as casual conversation. Isn't it sweet how Miss Hart's taken an interest in local business? Saw Ethan's garage getting repairs. Must have hit the lottery, huh? Wonder what she sees in a guy who wears the same boots every day. It wasn't cruel, at least not at first. It was curious, suspicious, the way small towns look at anything that doesn't fit into the stories they've already written. The broke mechanic and the rich woman. It didn't matter how hard Ethan worked or how quietly Isabella moved. People didn't see effort. They saw contrast, oil stains and silk scarves, wrenches and whispered fortunes. And contrast makes headlines, even when no one's printing them. At the grocery store, Ethan overheard two women talking near the tomatoes. He always seemed decent. Maybe she's just slumming it for the novelty. He turned the corner without making a sound, the sting sharp in his chest. At the school pickup line, one father nudged another. Think she's buying the garage next? The other just smirked. Or maybe the guy running it. Even Ava came home one afternoon with a strange look on her face. A girl at school said Miss Isabella Must be your girlfriend, because you can't afford a roof without a rich lady." She said it like it was a riddle she didn't quite understand. Ethan knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "People talk when they don't know the truth, kiddo. That doesn't make them right." She thought about it, then asked, "So what is the truth?" He paused, then said, "The truth is sometimes good people help each other. That's all." But later, alone in the garage, as the new beams went up and the smell of fresh sawdust filled the air, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if kindness could survive a story louder than the truth. And somewhere across town, Isabella heard the rumors too. She just didn't care. The night was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes when most of the town is asleep and the wind has finally run out of things to say. The garage had long since closed, but Ethan was still there, wiping down tools and humming to the old radio playing low in the background. He didn't hear the door open, just the familiar sound of her heels crossing concrete, softer than usual. Isabella stood in the glow of the overhead light, her coat draped over one arm, cheeks pink from the chill. Didn't mean to interrupt. Ethan looked up, surprised but not unwelcome. "You never do." She stepped closer, eyeing the neat rows of wrenches on the wall. "My dad used to organize his like that. Said if you couldn't find a tool with your eyes closed, you didn't respect the trade." Ethan smiled. "He a mechanic too?" She nodded. "The best. Taught me everything I know about engines, and how to curse in 3 languages. That made him laugh. She leaned against the workbench, her expression shifting, the way it always did when she wasn't wearing her armor. "I didn't grow up with money, Ethan," she said. "Not even close. We had a 1-car garage, 2 bedrooms, and a heater that worked every other winter." He didn't say anything. He knew this wasn't a moment for interruption. "I got a scholarship, got lucky, took a risk on a company no one believed in, and it worked. The rest?" She waved vaguely, as if gesturing to the life people always assume she had. "It came after." Ethan wiped his hands and leaned beside her. "So why Hollow Creek?" She looked at him then, not with the careful calculation she gave the world, but with the honesty of someone tired of pretending. "Because everything I built started feeling like a lie. Every meeting, every deal, every fake smile. I came here to breathe, to remember who I was before the numbers." He nodded slowly. "And me?" She held his gaze. "You're not a project, Ethan. You're the first thing in a long time that doesn't feel hollow." For a while they didn't speak, and in that silence, something real finally settled between them, something neither of them felt the need to explain. The afternoon sun poured through the kitchen window, casting lazy stripes across the table where Ava sat coloring with her favorite set of markers. Ethan was outside changing the oil in a neighbor's truck, and Isabella had stopped by to drop off a book Ava had lent her, one with dog-eared pages and glitter stickers covering the cover. While Isabella waited, Ava rummaged through her bag for another story to share, when a small piece of thick paper slipped from between 2 notebooks and fluttered to the floor. She picked it up, curious. "Hey, what's this?" she asked, squinting at the faded ink. Isabella looked over and froze, just for a second. The slip was cream-colored, edges slightly bent, with elegant black print reading, "Bachelor Auction, Hollow Creek Elementary, Entry Number 12, Ethan Cole, winning bid $5,000. Ava flipped it around like it was some kind of golden ticket. "You kept the auction receipt?" Isabella smiled, soft and just a little wistful. "I did." "But why? It's just a piece of paper." She knelt down so she was eye level with Ava, brushing a strand of hair from the little girl's forehead. "Because it started something brave." Ava tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it was the night your dad stood on a stage with nothing but his heart and a wrinkled suit. And he didn't flinch. He didn't know if anyone would choose him, but he showed up anyway. That's bravery." Ava looked at the receipt again, her voice small. "Some of the kids said you only bid on him because you felt sorry." Isabella's smile didn't fade. That's not true, sweetheart. I didn't bid on him because I felt sorry. I did it because I saw someone worth standing beside, and maybe because I was trying to be brave too. Ava turned the paper over in her hands again, then looked up. Can I keep it? Of course. She folded it carefully, like something fragile, and just like that, it became more than a receipt. It became a reminder of a moment when two lives quietly collided and something real began. The knock came late, just after Ava had gone to bed, and Ethan was elbow-deep in dirty dishes, letting the quiet of the evening wrap around the house like a worn blanket. He dried his hands on a towel, not thinking much of it. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone needing help with their water heater again. But when he opened the door, the cold air that rushed in wasn't half as sharp as the voice that followed. "Hello, Ethan." There she stood, Rachel, his late wife's sister. Same crisp posture, same careful clothes, same eyes that always seemed to be measuring what he lacked. He hadn't seen her in over a year. The last time, it ended in hushed tension outside a hospital room, both of them raw from grief and worn thin with unspoken blame. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said quietly. She stepped inside uninvited, eyeing the small house, the laundry folded on the couch, the crayon drawings taped to the wall. "I was passing through. Thought I'd check in on Ava." Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's asleep." Rachel looked around, nose slightly wrinkled. "She still has that asthma problem?" "She's doing fine." "Fine's not always enough," she said, cutting. "I've been thinking lately. Maybe Ava deserves more. Stability. Opportunity. A better environment." He blinked. "You're kidding." "I'm not," she said, matter of fact. "Your garage is falling apart. You're working 70 hours a week, and she's being raised around strangers. I saw that article about the auction. Isabella Hart? That's who she's spending time with now?" He didn't answer. Not yet. "I'm not trying to be cruel," she added, "but maybe it's time to consider if Ava would be better off." "Stop," he said, voice low but shaking. "You weren't there when her mom died. You didn't hold her when she cried every night. You didn't teach her to ride a bike or read bedtime stories on nights I could barely keep my eyes open." His voice cracked, the words pushed out like splinters. "Don't you dare walk in here and act like you love her more just because your shoes cost more." Rachel flinched, but didn't back down. Behind them, Isabella stood in the doorway, silent until now. She'd come by to return a borrowed book, but hadn't wanted to interrupt. Now she saw Ethan, shoulders heavy, eyes burning, pride breaking. She stepped forward and gently touched his arm. He didn't look at her, but he didn't pull away. The rain came soft that night, just a steady hush against the tin roof of the garage, like the sky was trying not to wake anyone. Most of the town had shut down hours ago, lights dimmed, streets empty. But inside the garage, a single lamp glowed over Ethan's workbench. The scent of motor oil hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint traces of soap on his hands and the cool dampness of early spring. Isabella had stopped by without warning, a habit she was slowly growing into. No agenda, no schedule, just a cup of chamomile tea in one hand and a quiet presence that somehow never felt out of place. "I figured you'd still be here," she said, slipping off her coat. "Figured right," Ethan replied, not looking up from the old alternator he was rebuilding. "This one's for Mrs. Hanley. Her car's more rust than engine, but she needs it to get to her doctor in town." Isabella sat on the bench beside him, close enough that their knees almost touched. She didn't speak, just watched him work the way she always did when she knew his thoughts were louder than his words. They stayed like that for a while, tools clicking, rain tapping, the world narrowing to the small circle of light around them. Then, without meaning to, her hand brushed his. It wasn't dramatic, just the back of her fingers grazing his skin as she reached for a flashlight. But it was enough. Enough to pull the silence into something tighter. Enough to pause the rhythm of his movements. Ethan froze. For one long second, neither of them moved. Her fingers lingered. His breath caught. Then, gently, he pulled away. Not harshly, not with regret, just not yet. Isabella didn't say anything. She didn't ask, didn't shift. She just let her hand fall into her lap and gave him the smallest smile, one that understood. He went back to working, slower now. She sipped her tea, staring at the floor like it held secrets. They didn't talk about it. They wouldn't. Not then. But the moment stayed between them, humming quietly beneath the sound of rain. The boardroom in the city towered above the skyline, glass walls, polished marble floors, and a conference table that could seat 20, though only 8 had shown up. Isabella sat at the head, her notes crisp, her blazer tailored, her name etched in gold on the screen behind her. On paper she belonged. She always had. But halfway through the meeting, she realized she couldn't remember why she cared. The men around her spoke in numbers. They dissected quarterly gains and pivot strategies, tossed around phrases like monetize empathy and optimize user sentiment, as if people were just data points. No one asked how the product helped anyone. No one asked if it made anything better. They only asked if it scaled. Isabella leaned back in her chair, tuning out the finance director droning on about projected growth. Her eyes drifted across the table to men who had never built anything from nothing, never taken a real risk, never stood beside someone just because it felt right. Her thoughts wandered back to Hollow Creek, to Ethan, to a little girl who believed in crayon rainbows and fixing things that mattered, to laughter in a garage filled with rust and heart. That was real. This was noise in a skyscraper that no longer touched the ground. A partner across the table asked her a question about expansion. She looked up, blinked once, and simply said, "No." The room stilled. "Excuse me?" he asked. "I'm not doing this," she replied, folding her folder shut. "Not like this." The COO leaned forward. "Isabella, we're in the middle of finalizing." "I know what we're in the middle of, but I also know what I'm walking away from." She stood, gathering her things. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "If all you see is my wallet, then you've already missed what makes this worth building." No one stopped her. No one dared. She walked out of the room, heels echoing down the sterile hallway, each step lighter than the last. Outside, the sky was gray, but it didn't matter, because for the first time in a long time, Isabella Hart wasn't running from anything. She was walking towards something that felt like truth. The school bell rang at 3 o'clock sharp, and a wave of squeals, backpacks, and sneakers hit the sidewalk like a parade that didn't know it was a parade. Parents leaned against car doors, chatting about homework and weekend plans. Ethan stood in his usual spot under the sycamore tree, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd for Ava's bright yellow jacket. But today, someone else was waiting there too. Isabella Hart. No town car, no assistant, no blazer or heels, just jeans, a faded sweatshirt with a tiny coffee stain near the hem, and 2 dripping cones of mint chocolate chip clutched in one hand. She looked slightly awkward, like someone trying not to stand out and failing only because she always kind of did. Ethan blinked. "Didn't expect to see you here." She shrugged, holding out one of the cones. "I had a craving. Figured it might taste better if I shared it." Ava spotted her before Ethan could say more and raced over, eyes lighting up. "Miss Isabella, you got ice cream?" "Only the best kind," she said, handing her a cone. "Melty, and probably too much sugar." They sat on the curb together, Ava swinging her legs, talking about spelling words and how Mrs. Barker's cat got loose during art class. Isabella listened, really listened, not just with polite nods, but with questions, laughs, and that rare kind of attention kids notice when adults mean it. Ethan stood nearby watching them, watching her. No cameras, no curated version of herself. Just a woman who bought ice cream and showed up. At one point, Ava said, "You ever have the kind with the bubble gum in the middle?" Isabella grinned. "I used to get that every summer with my dad. He said it was like chewing memories." Ava laughed. "That's weird. I like it." Ethan finally sat down beside them, his cone already softening in the sun. So, what brings you to the curbside life? She looked at him, then back at the school, the kids running and yelling and spilling juice boxes. I guess I wanted to see what matters to the people who matter to me. And in that moment, 3 people, 1 curb, and melting ice cream, it didn't feel like a town of whispers or status or second-guessing. It just felt like summer. It started as a scrap of thought he couldn't shake. Late one night, after Ava had fallen asleep with a book on her chest and the house had gone quiet, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a mug of coffee he didn't really want. He stared at the blank page, then finally began to write. Isabella. He paused. Not Miss Hart, not to whom it may concern. Just her name, plain and honest. I don't know if you realize what you did that night. When you raised your hand, it wasn't just a bid. It was something else entirely. A lifeline, maybe. Or a reminder that I still mattered, even if I didn't shine like the others. He scratched out the next line, rewrote it. I didn't need saving, but I needed to be seen, and you did that. The letter continued in fits and starts. He wrote about the garage, about Ava, about the fear that lived just beneath his ribs, the kind that never truly left when you were a single parent trying to hold it all together, and about how her presence had chipped away at that fear piece by quiet piece, without ever making it feel like charity. I don't know where this thing between us is going. I don't even know what it is, but I want you to know it's real to me. You're real to me. He read it twice, folded it once, slid it into an envelope. But he never gave it to her. It stayed tucked in the top drawer of his nightstand, beneath old receipts and a photo of Ava with cake on her nose. Days passed, then weeks. And every time he thought about handing it to her, something stopped him. Pride, doubt, the fear of too much, too soon. One rainy Saturday, Ava was hunting for batteries and opened the drawer. She found the envelope. She read it carefully, lips moving slowly, eyes wide. Then she smiled, the kind of smile only kids have, full of knowing. And when she slipped the letter into her backpack, she didn't tell him. Not yet. The town fair was in full swing by sunset, string lights flickering overhead, booths packed with homemade pies and lopsided lemonade stands, the scent of kettle corn drifting through the air like nostalgia. Kids ran barefoot through the grass, and parents laughed with that rare kind of ease that only comes when the world feels small and safe. Ethan stood near the pie booth, Ava on his shoulders, her sticky fingers waving at her friends. Isabella was somewhere nearby. He hadn't seen her in a while, but he knew she was there. That kind of presence didn't vanish. It lingered even when you weren't looking. Ava eventually wiggled down, lured away by a face-painting station. Ethan wandered toward the main stage, drawn by the hum of old country music and the low hum of people beginning to sway. And then she was there. Isabella stepped beside him without a word, her hair down for once, a soft breeze catching its ends. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, eyes scanning the couples dancing near the bandstand. Old pairs, new lovers, teenagers pretending they weren't nervous. Then a slow song started. Not flashy, not romantic on purpose, just something warm and familiar. "Dance with me," she said. Ethan blinked. "Here?" She took his hand like the question didn't need answering. He followed her into the crowd without thinking, without planning. One hand found her waist, the other her hand. Her fingers fit into his like they'd been rehearsing. They didn't talk. They just moved. The rest of the world faded. The booths, the music, the lights, all of it blurred into the background. There was no garage, no headlines, no questions. Just the sound of her breathing close to his ear and the rhythm of 2 people who had finally stopped overthinking everything. Ethan didn't know how long the song lasted, only that when it ended, they didn't pull apart right away. Isabella looked up at him, not with mystery or caution, but with peace. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole didn't feel like he had to fix anything. It already felt whole. The sky was the kind of blue that made everything feel possible. No clouds, no wind, just sunlight warm enough to make people linger a little longer at stop signs and walk a little slower past the corner of Maple and Main, where Turner Auto sat, reborn. Ethan stood in front of the garage with grease on his hands and disbelief in his eyes. The repairs were done. The roof no longer leaked. The walls were repainted in a deep slate gray. New tools lined the pegboard, gleaming under the soft overhead lights like a promise. Even the floor, usually a battlefield of bolts and oil stains, had been cleaned, coated, and sealed until it almost looked too clean to trust. But it wasn't the tools or the paint that stopped him cold. It was the banner. Turner Auto, it read in bold navy letters, the same name his father had painted by hand when the shop first opened, and beneath it, in a softer, brushed script, built on grit, fueled by grace. Ethan didn't know who had written it, maybe Isabella, maybe Ava, maybe both, but the words felt like a heartbeat, like someone had seen straight through him and written down exactly what he'd been trying to prove all these years. By mid-morning, customers began to trickle in, Mrs. Hanley with her old Buick, two teenagers whose muffler rattled like a toolbox, a young couple with a flat tire and no spare. No one mentioned the banner out loud, but nearly everyone looked at it. Ava ran in just before lunch, hair in a messy ponytail and marker on her hands. "You saw it, right?" she said breathlessly, pointing. "Do you like it?" He bent down and pulled her into a hug. "I love it." Isabella showed up a few minutes later. No ceremony, no grand speech, just a paper bag with sandwiches and that look in her eyes, quiet pride, warm and certain. They didn't need to say anything. The open door said it all. Turner Auto wasn't just back in business. It was home again, stronger, steadier, and this time not built alone. The offer came on a Tuesday. Ethan was elbow-deep in an engine bay, sweat clinging to his neck despite the fan spinning overhead, when the sleek black sedan rolled up in front of the shop. It didn't belong. Not just the car, but the energy it carried. Clean, calculated, too polished for a place that smelled like burnt rubber and hard work. Out stepped a man in a designer suit, his shoes barely making a sound on the gravel. He didn't bother with small talk, just walked straight up to Ethan and extended a hand, all smooth confidence and practiced charm. "Ethan Cole, name's Bradford Kent. I represent Midstate Auto Holdings. We've been watching what you've done with Turner Auto. Impressive revival. Very marketable." Ethan stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Thanks. What can I do for you?" Bradford smiled like he already owned the place. "We're offering to buy you out. Full acquisition. Keep your name on the building. Turner Auto has a great story, but we scale it. 5 more shops across the state within 18 months. Franchise potential is through the roof." Ethan blinked, the words hitting him like a cold splash. Bradford continued, "We'd retain you as a consultant, of course. Your story's part of the charm. Single dad, small-town grit. Customers eat that up. And don't worry, your daughter's education, we'll handle it. Full package." Ava's future. More money than he'd ever seen. A shiny world of stability. But as Bradford spoke, Ethan felt something harden in his chest, something that didn't want to be repackaged or sold. He looked around, at the new roof he rebuilt, the tools he touched every day, the picture of Ava still taped to the office window, and in that silence, he shook his head. "No," Bradford blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm not for sale," Ethan said, steady now. "This garage isn't a brand, it's a life, one I built with my hands and mistakes and a lot of damn heart." Behind him, the door creaked open. Isabella stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching. When Bradford left, speechless and insulted, Ethan turned toward her. She didn't say much, just walked forward and gently touched his shoulder. "That," she said, smiling, "is the man I bid on." The snow came out of nowhere. One minute the sky was just overcast, the kind of moody gray that usually passed without fuss. The next, the wind picked up like a warning, and flakes started falling thick and fast. swirling like confetti with no celebration attached. By the time Ethan looked up from the brake line, he was tightening. The entire street outside had vanished beneath a white blur. He grabbed his coat, stepped out front, and saw it for what it was. One of those freak storms that didn't care about forecasts or school schedules, the kind that shut down towns and turned headlights into fireflies. Then the door creaked open behind him. Isabella. She stood there in a long coat dusted with snow, cheeks flushed, eyes wide with that mix of annoyance and awe. So, I may have underestimated the weather. You walked here? I drove halfway, she said, brushing snow from her sleeves. Slid the rest. Parked it a block back. You were closer than my house. He chuckled. Guess that makes this the safest place in town. The storm made the decision for them. Roads closed. Power flickered. Cell signal died. By evening, the garage became their refuge, lit by battery lanterns and warmed only by the small space heater Ethan barely trusted. They dragged out 2 chairs and a few thick blankets from the storage room. Ava was spending the night with a friend, thankfully dry and safe, and for once Ethan had nothing to do but wait out the cold. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about the first car he ever fixed, a rusted-out Civic that belonged to his high school shop teacher. She told him about the time she backpacked alone through Spain with 20 euros and a pair of hiking boots. They laughed over burnt instant coffee. They played 20 questions using a pack of old mechanic receipts. At some point, she stole his hoodie. At another, he noticed she hadn't stopped smiling in hours. The storm howled outside. Inside, their breath came out in soft clouds, and yet, somehow, it felt warm. Not from the heater, not from the blankets, from something that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with timing. The storm was over by morning. Sunlight poured through the garage windows, bright and golden, catching on the frost that lined the panes. The snow outside was untouched, a perfect blanket stretching across the lot, covering everything in silence. The world for once felt paused, like even time itself was willing to let things breathe. Ethan stood by the workbench, nursing a fresh mug of coffee brewed from an emergency stash he kept for long nights and worse mornings. It was strong, bitter, and somehow perfect. He didn't say much. Neither did Isabella. She was sitting on the stool next to him, still wrapped in the hoodie she'd borrowed the night before. Her hair was tousled from sleep, her eyes soft with the kind of quiet that comes after laughter, after honesty, after something real has been said without ever needing to be spoken out loud. He watched her. Not the way she looked, but the way she was. Here, still. She hadn't called for a driver or asked when the roads would clear. She hadn't fidgeted, hadn't looked out the window with one foot halfway out the door. She stayed. Through cold, through quiet, through a night with nothing but stories and shared glances and space too fragile to name. And in that stillness, something shifted in him, not all at once, not like a movie, just slowly, completely. He set the mug down. She looked up. And he leaned in, carefully, like the air might crack if he rushed it, and kissed her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she was kind, though she always had been, but because she'd stayed, when she could have left, when the world had handed her every reason to keep moving. Her lips met his, soft and sure. No hesitation, no questions. When they pulled apart, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Outside, the snow sparkled under the morning light. Inside, something even quieter had finally found its voice. It started with a photo. Someone at the town fair had snapped a shot of Isabella and Ethan mid-dance, his hand at her waist, her forehead resting lightly against his cheek, both of them smiling like the rest of the world had stopped spinning. It was tender, real, and it should have just stayed a memory. But it didn't. By Monday morning, the photo had gone viral. Local gossip turned national curiosity. Online blogs ran with it first. Small-town mechanic sweeps billionaire heiress off her heels. Then came the tabloids. Billionaire buys a date, and stays. Headlines meant to stir attention, not truth. Ethan found out from a neighbor who shoved a phone in his face, chuckling. "Looks like you made the big leagues, Cole." He read the article in silence. It was a shallow piece. Photos from the auction, the ice cream outside Ava's school, a blurry shot of Isabella walking into the garage during the storm. The quotes were all pulled from people he barely spoke to. The comments were worse. "She must be slumming it. Probably a publicity stunt. No way she's really into him. Look at his shoes." Isabella saw it too. Of course she did. She called him that night, voice steady but a little too calm. "It's noise," she said. "This happens, it'll pass." But Ethan didn't have the armor she did. He wasn't used to being a story. He wasn't used to being looked at like a question mark. At the gas station, people stared longer. At the grocery store, a woman asked him what his plan was now, like he'd won the lottery and needed financial advice. Worst of all, Ava came home from school with tears in her eyes. "A girl said you're only with Miss Isabella because she's rich," she whispered. Like repeating it gave the words more power. Ethan knelt in front of her, trying to find something to say, something strong, something honest. But the truth was, he didn't know how to quiet a storm he didn't ask for. He just knew one thing. He hadn't fallen for her fortune. He'd fallen for the woman who ate melting ice cream at the curb, who showed up in a storm, who danced like nobody was watching until the whole world suddenly was. It was show and tell Friday in Mrs. Langley's second-grade classroom, and Ava Cole had been waiting all week for her turn. She stood at the front of the room wearing her sparkly sneakers and the kind of confidence that only comes when a kid knows her story matters. Her backpack sat open behind her, a crumpled drawing pulled carefully from the side pocket and clutched in both hands. "My show and tell is about my dad," she said, holding up the drawing for the class to see. 3 stick figures stood under a crooked rainbow, her dad, and Isabella. All holding hands. A dog barked from the corner of the page, and the words "Us Together" were scrawled in purple marker across the top. Some of the kids smiled. Some tilted their heads, trying to decode the art. "My dad's name is Ethan," Ava continued, clearing her throat with a proud little bounce. "He fixes cars and teaches me stuff like how to check oil and how to make grilled cheese without burning it." The class giggled. "But that's not why I picked him. I picked him because he's brave." She paused, glancing at her teacher. "Even when people say weird stuff online or look at him funny in stores, he doesn't stop being kind, and he doesn't hide who he is." Then came the part she hadn't practiced. She lowered the drawing and looked at her classmates with wide, steady eyes. "Some people say my dad doesn't belong with someone like Miss Isabella, but I think they're wrong, because love doesn't care about money or big houses or if your hands get dirty." She smiled, her voice soft but clear. "My dad's not just mine anymore. We share him now." For a second the room was quiet. Then someone clapped, then another, and suddenly the whole class was cheering. Second graders with no filter, no judgment, just the kind of honest joy adults often forget how to carry. Mrs. Langley dabbed her eyes and nodded. "That was beautiful, Ava." Later, when Ethan picked her up at the curb, she climbed into the truck, handed him the drawing, and said, "You got applause today." He looked at her in the rearview mirror. "For what?" "For being ours." It was a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day that didn't ask for anything special. The sky was clear, the air smelled faintly of spring, and Ethan was running late, again. He tossed Ava's favorite snacks into her lunchbox while she brushed her hair in the hallway mirror, humming something off-key and happy. "Got your book? Shoes? Brain?" he called. "Yes, yes, and maybe," she shouted back with a giggle. He tucked a napkin into the lunchbox like he always did, usually with a doodle or a silly joke scribbled in blue ink. But today something else was already there, folded neatly, carefully, between the juice box and the peanut butter sandwich. He didn't notice it until later. When Ava came home from school that afternoon, she burst through the door with her usual tornado of energy, flopped onto the couch, and said, Miss Isabella left you a note. Ethan blinked. What? In my lunchbox. For you. She grinned. I didn't peek. Much. He opened the note slowly. It was written in Isabella's unmistakable handwriting, clean and sure. No ring, no speech, just this. Would it be okay if we kept dancing? There was no name signed. She didn't have to. Ethan read it twice. Then again, the corners of his mouth lifted, not into surprise, but into something deeper, something settled. Because she knew him, she knew he didn't need grand gestures or fireworks, just a question that felt like a whisper of forever. He didn't race over, didn't call. He waited until just before dusk, when the sun spilled gold over the roof of the garage and everything smelled like warmth and work. She was there, as if she knew he would come. He walked up, note still in hand, and said simply, "Yeah." She smiled, eyes soft. "Yeah?" He nodded. "Let's keep dancing. No crowd, no cameras. Just two people in the quiet space between maybe and always." And that was the only answer either of them needed. The lights were warmer this time, softer, more inviting. String bulbs hung from the rafters of the rec center, and the room buzzed not with nerves, but with laughter, the kind that came from people who remembered what happened here last year and were curious to see what might unfold this time. The annual Hollow Creek Elementary Bachelor Auction had returned, only this time it wasn't whispered about with awkward chuckles or pitying glances. This time Ethan Cole stood on stage, not as a bachelor, not as a question mark, as a host. Beside him stood Isabella Hart, graceful, radiant, grounded. No spotlight could outshine the ease in her smile or the way her hand rested gently on Ethan's arm as they took in the room together. "All right," Isabella said into the microphone, her voice light and confident. "Welcome back, Hollow Creek, and thank you for proving that sometimes small towns know how to make the biggest moments." The crowd cheered. Ethan stepped forward, microphone in hand, heart full. "Last year," he began, clearing his throat, "I stood on this very stage, wearing the same shoes, the same nerves, and maybe a little too much cologne." Laughter rippled through the audience. "And last year," he continued, "someone raised their hand not out of pity, but out of something a little braver. And that moment changed my life." He looked at Isabella. She smiled. "So tonight," he said, gesturing toward the side curtain, "I'd like to introduce the first bachelor of the evening. He's a great mechanic, a better man, and one of my oldest friends, and I owe him everything, because without him, I wouldn't have stepped onto this stage in the first place." The crowd clapped as a bashful-looking man emerged, waving nervously. Isabella leaned in and whispered, "That was sweet." Ethan grinned. "Didn't want to steal your thunder." "You already did," she said softly. As the night went on, as paddles lifted and music played, the air buzzed not with judgment, but with joy, and the town that once whispered, now it clapped, for what had been built, for what had endured, for love that had dared to stay. The paper was titled, "The Moment That Changed Everything." Ava Cole, now older, steadier, and with her father's quiet determination in her voice, stood in front of her class with her essay in hand. She wore her favorite denim jacket and a nervous smile, but as she began to read, her voice didn't waver. "My dad thought no one would raise a hand for him, but someone did, and it changed all our lives." A hush fell over the room. She continued, eyes scanning her classmates, but heart somewhere else entirely. "It was just a school fundraiser, a bachelor auction. I didn't even understand what that meant back then. I just remember sitting in a folding chair, swinging my legs, wondering why no one was raising their hand when my dad walked on stage. He looked nice, nervous but nice. I knew what he was worth, even if no one else seemed to." She smiled softly, and then she raised her hand, Isabella Hart. No one saw it coming, but she did. With one bid, she didn't just change his night. She changed everything, not because she saved him, but because she saw him. A few students leaned forward, drawn into the story like it was fiction. My dad always says he didn't fall in love because she was rich or beautiful, which she is, but because she stayed. Because when it got hard, she didn't walk away. She danced with him. Through storms, through silence, through stuff that doesn't fit neatly into fairy tales. She folded the paper gently, her words now her own. And now, years later, I look back and realize it wasn't just about a man and a woman. It was about what happens when someone sees you and still chooses you. She glanced toward the back of the room, where Ethan and Isabella sat side by side, holding hands like it was still their first quiet dance. That night started with an auction, but what came after, that was the real win. That was the forever. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a beat longer than usual. Then it erupted in applause, and in the back row, her dad wiped his eyes with the edge of his sleeve, just like he always did when his heart got too full to hold.